folks, Sam here. Lately people have been calling me True Arrow. Just out in the Australian bush, searching for Plato's cave and keeping an eye out for bunyips and the infamous drop bears. Here it is, folks. So I'm just going to pop down into the cave. Certainly is dark down there. Now, I'd like to acknowledge the hundreds of thousands of people who have been turning up at protests right across Australia over the last few weeks, especially in Melbourne. I've seen amazing signs, t-shirts, lots of different flags and all kinds of adornments. On Saturday, the 11th of December, one particular sign caught my eye. So why is this sign interesting, you might ask? And a very good question. It makes reference to a story that is nearly 2,500 years old, written by Plato, called The Allegory of the Cave. I learned about this in March 2020 when I toured Professor Stephen Hicks, a Canadian-American philosopher, to talk about the perils of postmodernism. This series of talks were perhaps the last live events in Australia before we became Upside Down World. Verus Greenus. Now, if you don't know this word postmodernism, it's not about art. Think adjusted socialism after communism didn't quite work. Back in the 60s, a group of philosophers, largely in France, readjusted their pathway to find their utopia. Postmodernism is more alive today than ever before. Bit of smoke coming from down there. I'll be down in a minute. If communism is about blowing up the house with a tank, postmodernism is about putting termites into the walls, here and there, and over long decades, the house comes down under its own weight. The house is, of course, liberal values, freedoms, society, and democracy. Well, it sure is beautiful up here, but I heard someone at the top of the cave trying to get out, so I'm going to go give them a hand. No, I lost them. There's something up here. It's very bright. Now, in the last session of the series with Professor Stephen Hicks, he covered Plato's allegory of the cave. The allegory, or visual representation with hidden meaning, is about people stuck in a shadow reality, in a cave, who need to break free of their chains to come experience the big, wide world. Hello, I'm a puppet. Now, the people living in the cave have been living there since youth, chained to the walls, and they're watching the shadows on those walls. The shadows are created by a puppet master putting their puppet in front of the fire. Ooh. Now, the fire is a metaphor for political indoctrination, or indoctrination in education. To break free of the shadows, one has to go through a few painful experiences. Get these on just in case there's some pepper spray down there. So Plato's cave is very symbolic of perhaps what a lot of you have been experiencing in attempts to get people out of the shadow world. But rather than me babbling on about it, I'm going to let Stephen Hicks explain it to you in a very succinct, visual and easy to understand manner. I'm going to head back down into the cave to see if I can pull somebody else out, and I'd like you in the comments section to put down any strategies that you've had in being successful in getting someone out of the cave. Goggles check.
I want to give you a somewhat secularized version of this that's very prominent in Plato. There's often references to Plato's cave, and it's one of these very fruitful metaphors that has a number of angles to it, but I want to emphasize the ethics angle and how divine command theory, even in more secularized forms, leads to a certain understanding of social morality and politics. So the way Plato puts it this way is to say, and there's a metaphysics that's built in here, we have two worlds. We have this lower world, which is a cave, and you can see in a shadowy way there are some people there. I'll come back to them. And that's meant to be representative of this lower physical world that we happen to be born into. But then there's a higher world outside of the cave, a real world, a higher world, and also there are some people there as well. But what Plato argues is that all of us at birth start here, and if you look closely, there are some figures in this shadowy area, and the way Socrates, who's Plato's mouthpiece at this point, describes it, says, this is us. We're born into the world and we're chained into this lower world. And so these are figures that are chained at the bottom of the cave, and all of their lives they've just been sitting there and they're watching what's going on the back of the cave. And there you can see there are some shadowy figures. Now, behind them, there is this stone wall, and behind the stone wall, there are some other shadowy figures, and what they're doing is they have these sticks with cutout animals, trees, right, and so forth. And these guys speak and they walk around back and forth, and they hold these things up. And there's a fire here, so what that means is the fire projects light, and then on the back of the cave there are the shadows. But since these guys have been trapped here for their whole life, they think that's reality. Those are real objects. And so the point then is they are starting in a position of ignorance, and what they think is true knowledge isn't really true knowledge. And so we all need to go through a process of acquiring true knowledge. Now, the way the story goes, Plato will say, is someone has to come along and try to rescue these people. This person will come down into the cave, break the chains, force the person to stand up, and then to turn their head to face backwards toward the light. As the story goes, right, we would stand up here, we would turn around, and we would realize that what we thought was reality before was really just a shadow or reflection of something much more real. The light hurts our eyes. It's kind of a painful process, but nonetheless, our liberator is telling us, you have to look, this is for your own good, whether you want to or not. We find, of course, we've been sitting for a long time, and our muscles aren't used to standing for a long time, so it's a physically painful process as well. So what eventually happens then is one of these people gets dragged, and these are people who are in the process here. And you'll see there's the guide reaching down to help pull this person up. Eventually they will get out into the light, and you will see true reality, higher reality, including the sun, the source of all light, the source of all warmth, the source of all being. You become an enlightened being. And then you realize all of these higher truths, and that basically everything that people believe down in the lower world in the cave is just false and opinions and not real reality. And you are now a member of the elite, one of the enlightened ones. You then, as one of the enlightened ones, have an obligation. If you're self-interested and individualist, you want to just, frolic in the sun and play with the animals in the higher world, but you realize that there are still poorer, deficit people down in the lower world, and you feel pity for them and a sense of moral obligation, not to do anything that's going to be beneficial to you, but to go back down into that stinky, dark cave and rescue as many of your fellow humans as you can. Now, of course, when you go back down into the cave, you are enlightened, and you go down to the bottom of the cave. And what happens when you go from a very bright place into a very dark place? Well, your eyes aren't accustomed to it, and you start stumbling around in the dark. But of course, you're coming down, you're all full of enthusiasm for your newfound knowledge, and you're saying to everybody down there, hey, I have seen the light, follow me, right? And what's their reaction going to be? Get out of my face, right? You're nuts, you're crazy, right? And then they'll start testing you and say, well, what's on the wall? And you say, well, I can't really see in these lower realities. I'm blinded by the higher light. And they'll say, well, this is just a crazy guy. To make them stand up, to turn around, to face the light, to drag them up to the top of the cave, and so forth. So what we then have is a physicalistic, moralistic imposition ethic that's built into a dualistic kind of metaphysics. Now, if that's the case, that the good is not to be found in this lower world, then the important thing is to get out of the lower world, get up to the higher world. Very influential story over the course of millennia. And this then in secular form has justified some fairly authoritarian, right, forms of education. In religious form, we know that, of course, religious education can tend into authoritarian methods as well, obey higher authority or else, and so that model comes down.
I was so close that time. Oh, banging my head against the wall. It is hard work. That was a 5-minute segment from 12 hours of content of Professor Hicks talking about the perils of postmodernism as a way to help others. Don't forget to put your strategy into the comments section of pulling someone out of the shadow world. Oh, that's enough shadows for one day. No drop airs up there. In conclusion, it was a very good sign, and I highly encourage you to watch some of the series of Professor Hicks talking about the perils of postmodernism, which can be found on the True Arrow channel. The termites have been in the walls for a very long time.
Hi.
Yeah.
Scared me.
Sorry. I'm not hunting the predator. Also, True Arrow, aka me, does need your support, so please look in the video description for support options. Thank you. Oh. Yowie. But how do we know if we're actually out of the cave? And it's a tricky one, and I think the best thing is to practice critical thinking, open-mindedness, and do a lot of research for this particular scenario. So I'm just out in the Australian bush here, searching for Plato's cave, and just keeping an eye out for bunyips and drop bears.